Hey, welcome back. At the end of this episode, I'm going to announce a webinar that I'm going to do for questions and answers and everything you want to talk about that concerns capture. Make sure you stick around for that. Let's start. So far, we've been capturing only big picture stuff. We've discussed right brain holistic thinking that describe the character of the subject and left brain thinking that analyze its structure. But what about details? Often, details are a huge part of what makes an idea or an impression interesting in the first place. Of course, when capturing details, we enter a dangerous territory because capture is supposed to be quick. So if you start getting into details, you can easily ruin the whole thing. Still, a smart and careful use of detail can add a lot of character to your captures. Here's a quick example. Sketch number 1 captures a dry left brain structure of this design. Now, in sketch number 2, I've added just a few details here and there, really not a lot, and I think you can see how suddenly it feels somehow rich and full of texture, even though it's really not that far from the first sketch. You can see how quickly you can get from a completely uninteresting capture to something that has just the right amount of information to let your brain start filling in the gaps and imagining a whole experience which is not really there at all. Our brain is really good at this kind of thing, and it also really likes doing that. Which is why captures, like minimalistic art, can be really very charming and have this strange pull that makes you want to gaze at it for a long time. So if just a few details made our capture that much better, maybe we should add more. So in sketch number 3 I did add some more, and as you can see, it didn't improve. It actually got busy, and now your brain is kind of bombarded with information, and it's bored with it. There's nothing left for it to add. There's no gap to fill, and there's no participation, and so all the charm is almost completely gone. Also, as I mentioned a couple of times, speed is an important element of a good capture, and this kind of detailed sketch simply takes too long to do, and it just loses that concentrated energy of a real quick capture. So the secret for a great capture is to start with big picture thinking, left brain and right brain as we said, and then add a few details, just a few details very carefully, like a really strong spice. Just a few drops make it great, but add too much and it really becomes uneatable. This approach is great because it makes for captures that feel both simple and rich. They're very engaging for the imagination, and they're really quick to do, and they give you a lot of focus. Exaggeration is a good way to create very clear captures. The idea is simple. You allow yourself to actually distort the subject in order to express important features as boldly and as strongly as possible. It's very much like making a caricature of what you're seeing in the subject. Again, the Eiffel sketches make a really good example. Here the point is made that the tower is messy, even though it's obviously not that messy in real life. Nevertheless, you do recognize it to be Eiffel, and the point of view is put forward very clearly. Exaggeration is great for communicating clearly when you can't rely on accuracy and subtle nuances, like when you're working really fast and rough. So you exaggerate the capture, and then you can tone it down in later stages when accuracy and nuances become possible again. Storyboards are a perfect example. The storyboard of a film is made relatively quickly with just a small team, so you can test different ideas, talk about them before you actually start shooting the film, and use it to visually communicate the ideas to the entire crew, from actors to VFX artists. So the whole idea of storyboarding is basically just a huge capture, right? Which means that when you do storyboards, fast work and clear communication is what it's all about. And exaggeration is one of the top tools of doing that. In this storyboard, for example, you can see how I drew a really strong pose here. Now, if you look at the final animation shot, you'll see that it was toned down quite a bit. And that's because in the final film, they have time to really carefully fine-tune the nuances of the pose, and also they can use music and color and lighting and sound effects and many other things to make sure the moment is really clear for the audience. So they can afford to tone down the actual pose because they have all these other elements. But all this is made possible because the storyboard that was drawn months before made a very clear statement of what that moment should be like. And that was done with a quick but exaggerated capture. To hammer that point in, here's the capture I made for that storyboard drawing. And yes, it's a capture of a capture, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But anyway, this is done in no more than a couple of seconds. So I really needed to capture that idea without even a real drawing. How did I do that? By going right brain on it, just spitting out my most instinctive and raw impression, and then exaggerating the point as much as I could. So let's talk some more about this idea of capturing a capture. Let me start by pointing out that simplification and minimalism come in many different levels. We just saw an example of that with those storyboard sketches. Both drawings are captures, both are simplifications, but the doodle is a much more compressed form of capture. And you can decide what level of simplification you're going for. Different situations call for different solutions. So, if we stick with storyboarding, an internal capture, an internal storyboard that's going to be used by your own small team to make the film can be very simplified, very raw. But if you're outsourcing it to a different company, for example, then you'll have to make it much more approachable, much more readable. Then you have storyboards that are intended to actually sell something to a client or an investor, and here you'll really want to work up your captures and make them very clear and very attractive, right? By the way, I actually made the mistake once of sending an internal, very raw storyboard to a pretty important client, and it really almost didn't end up well at all. Anyway, the next step of this idea is that you can also move back and forth between different levels of simplification. For example, you can compress your capture to be more minimal, or you can expand it with more layers of information. This can be a really helpful technique in some situations. For example, in that storyboard we just saw, I started out with very raw sketches and then gradually expanded them to be more readable. I often use this technique when I need to focus my attention on the big picture, in this case the film I was trying to make, while handling lower level elements, in this case the drawings. When I'm happy with the way the big picture turned out, then I can turn my attention to these raw captures and expand them to be nicer. In other situations, you'll want to go the other way and compress a capture. That is, start with a more detailed capture and then make it leaner gradually. And this is a good technique for figuring out what's really important about your subject. A good example is what they call loglines in script writing. Basically, a logline is a very brief description of the entire film, 1 or 2 sentences usually. The result is basically what you have in your TV guide. So loglines are useful for getting the audience interested in watching the film, but they're also useful to get producers interested in the script in the first place. And it's also a great writing tool for the writer himself, because it can really focus your writing on the most critical, important elements of the story. Let's take Back to the Future, for example, and the logline for Back to the Future might be something like this. When a teenager from a dysfunctional family travels back in time, accidentally interrupting his parents' first meeting, he must bring them together or be erased from reality forever. The point is this. Capturing an entire feature film into just this one single sentence like that is pretty extreme and it's very difficult. I mean, it's alright for me to just sit there and summarize this film that was already made and that we all know very well. But imagine if you're the screenwriter and you've spent all that time developing the script from scratch, solving problems, coming up with funny moments and so on. Think about all the fun characters, all the little twists and turns of the plot and the subplots. It's not always easy for an artist, in this case a scriptwriter, to see clearly what's really essential in the work, especially after spending a lot of time on it. So in a case like this, starting with a more detailed capture, maybe half a page synopsis, and then gradually compressing it until you get that capture which is like the heart of the core of the essence of it, that's a really good way of doing it. Here you can see a digital sculpture with a capture sketch the artist did before starting to work. But if you look carefully, you can see a much more simplified capture that was made after the more elaborate sketch was already done. And it was made in order to focus the artist's understanding of what's important in that sculpture. Another example. These are some really quick sketches I made when I was preparing for that asterisk scene I was showing you a little bit before. So, as you can see, these are already quite simplified, but then I went ahead and simplified them even more, just to help me focus on what's really important in each pose. But I wouldn't have been able to get to these uber simplified sketches, if you will, without doing the other ones first. Some things just require a process. We've covered several techniques of simplifying a subject, including stuff like different levels of simplification, exaggeration, balancing details and big picture thinking, and most importantly, the principle of capturing our personal point of view of the subject rather than trying to give an objective description. We've also discussed in some length the difference between capturing on the right brain and capturing on the left brain. In the next section, I want to delve deeper into that magical instrument called our brain and see if we can get these two seemingly conflicting powers of logic on one side and intuition on the other side work together in harmony. So hopefully so far you have been learning by doing the exercises, experimenting with capturing already. So let's continue to do that. And what I would suggest that you do now is that you practice all of those techniques together and separately, but focus on the 6 techniques. And here's my suggestion: try this. Take a frame from a film, something that you feel something towards, and capture that frame, whether with words or with drawing or with any other way you think of, but as long as you can do it quickly. And by the way, I want to just say something here. I know that we're not taking too many examples from, let's say, web design or fashion design or what have you, but all of these things have the same element of capture and everything else we're going to talk about. It's just for the capturing, it's way easier to see those things in something which is a little bit more emotional, like a film and a story and stuff like that. So we are going to look at examples from these areas as well down the line, but for now, we're just doing it this way because there's just more meat in that. But I want to assure you that these same techniques and this same sort of capturing mindset works in all of those things as well. I just want to make sure that we know that this is not about making films. This is about how we create anything. Okay, just reminding you of that. Right, so back to the exercise. Choose a frame from a film, something that you feel something about, and then start with a sort of a bad, quote-unquote, capture, just something super basic. So for this image, it would be maybe a guy sitting in a room, okay? Like as simple as that. And then start one by one adding the techniques that we've talked about. So for example, you go, okay, how do I get personal? Well, maybe if I'm getting more personal, if I'm being more subjective, maybe it's this. And then how do I add details? How do I do left brain? How do I do right brain? How do I exaggerate? And you can experiment with those techniques either on top of each other, kind of adding elements with every step, or just kind of going like, okay, now I'm doing left brain, now I'm doing right brain. Now what happens when I capture the capture? Go, more condensed or more expanded. And just play around with it, with all 6 methods. And what I'd like you to do, if you will, is to write me a comment and tell me about the experience. Tell me about one thing that surprised you, one technique that really clicked for you. I would love to hear about that, okay? So, the webinar. I want us to get together and I want to give you a chance to ask some questions and to tell me about your experiences, maybe even show your captures, your capturing exercises. Just kind of get together, basically. And I think that the best time for that, perfect time for that, would be at the end of the whole element of capture. And I'm going to have a few announcements to make at that point as well. So, it's going to be really an interesting meeting to have. It's going to happen in a couple of weeks. So I'm just giving you a heads up, basically. This is something I'm really excited about. I hope you'll sign up. I'll add the details a bit later on. Make sure you add yourself to the emailing list down below in the description. You'll find a link for that so that you get all these communications and that you can join the webinar, that you get the link through there. And that's it for this video. As usual, if you like what's happening here, like and subscribe. Share it with people that you think that might, get something from this, and I will see you in the next video.